The dense, humid jungle of the unnamed planet, Naram, pressed down on Jonathan Vega as he hacked through the thick undergrowth with his shaking machete. Sweat glistened on his muscular form, and he wiped his forehead in frustration. Should have brought a proper team, he muttered under his breath, his growing irritation evident. This was supposed to be a routine resource survey, but instead, he found himself battling a hostile environment. His ship, Nomad, was far behind, and as Jonathan pushed forward, his mind drifted back to the reason he had volunteered for this solo assignment in the first place, the large reward from the Commerce Commission, along with a chance to escape the monotony of life after serving in the military. But this alien planet was proving to be more than just a test of his physical endurance, it was challenging. Suddenly, a blood-curdling scream pierced the thick air, a woman's cry, unmistakably filled with terror. Training kicked in almost immediately, and Jonathan moved towards the sound with silent, fluid precision. As he reached a clearing, he froze. Before him, a group of primitive aliens Krell were gathered around a fire. Hovering above the flames was a humanoid woman, her lavender-colored skin shimmering in the heat. Jonathan's stomach twisted in a painful knot. He wasn't here to play the hero. He had a job to do, and it didn't involve getting tangled up in alien conflicts. But when the desperate look in the woman's eyes locked onto his, everything changed. The decision to help her was not just an act of bravery, it was a personal calling, one that went against his training but also against his very heart. Jonathan knew saving her wouldn't be easy. The Krell were armed and aggressive. With quick thinking, he decided to offer them something they would understand: medicine. Give me the girl, and you'll receive a drug that can cure your people of their diseases. The Krell leader hesitated, eyeing the vaccine Jonathan had offered. After a tense exchange, the Krell agreed. The woman was freed, and Jonathan lifted her into his arms, feeling the weight of the decision he had just made. As he carried her away, Vera, the alien diplomat, whispered, "Thank you, human." Jonathan Vega from Earth. Her voice was soft, melodic, and completely at odds with the chaos of the jungle. She was grateful, but Jonathan could feel there was more to her story, a story that was much bigger than a simple rescue. With the Krell possibly on their trail, Jonathan led Vera back to his ship. The Nomad was small, efficient, and anything but luxurious, but it was safe. As they started their journey, Vera explained her background: a diplomat from the Astralis system, part of a team sent to explore Naram and seek potential alliances. But things had gone wrong. The Krell, initially cooperative, had turned hostile, attacking without warning. As they flew toward safety, the tension between Jonathan and Vera grew. He knew that the people of Vera and Earth had a strained relationship ever since the Proxima incident 3 years ago. Jonathan was torn. He wasn't involved in political schemes, he just wanted to finish his mission. But now, he found himself tied to this alien diplomat, and his actions could set off a chain of events neither of them could predict. Then, out of nowhere, an emergency signal from an Australian ship came through their communication system. It was under attack near the Taurus Nebula. Vera's eyes widened as she recognized the ship, the Celestial Envoy. Jonathan, already conflicted, now had to make another choice. Should he continue with his mission, or risk everything to help Vera's people? Without hesitation, Jonathan spoke, his voice resolute. "We're going to help them." A moment of silence followed before Vera nodded, her respect for him growing. "You'd risk everything for my people?" she asked, her voice filled with disbelief. Jonathan met her gaze, his expression serious. "I've already risked it for you, haven't I?" As they made their way to the distress signal, a new problem emerged: an asteroid belt with a hidden facility using a tractor beam to pull them off course. Jonathan was forced to fight his way through a distortion field while Vera warned her people. The tension escalated as they realized this mission was not just about survival, it was about navigating the dangerous currents of intergalactic politics and personal relationships. Finally, they arrived at the celestial envoy, only to discover that the attackers were not who they had expected. The rescue was far more complicated than they had imagined. As Jonathan and Vera worked together to save the ship, their bond deepened. But with the political consequences of their actions looming, the question remained, what would become of a human and an alien diplomat trapped between warring factions? After the chaos settled, Jonathan and Vera faced the aftermath. The immediate dangers were over, but their future was uncertain. As they made their way toward the neutral outpost of Helios, the ship became a small, confined space where two very different beings had to. As the nomad sped through the vastness of space, Jonathan could feel the tension building in a small, enclosed cabin. The air was thick with unspoken words, the silence pressing down on him from all sides. He glanced at Vera, who was sitting across from him, her eyes fixed on the stars outside the ship's viewport. Despite the gravity of their situation, she seemed composed, perhaps even serene. For Jonathan, however, everything felt uncertain. What had started as a simple mission for a reward had spiraled into something far more complicated. Now, not only was he entangled in intergalactic politics, but he also found himself forming an unlikely bond with an alien diplomat, whose people, and the people of Earth, were on the brink of a delicate diplomatic crisis. What now? Jonathan finally asked, breaking the silence. His voice was rough, as though the weight of everything was slowly wearing him down. Vera looked over at him, her lavender eyes gleaming with a mixture of wisdom and something he couldn't quite place. "We continue," she replied simply, her voice steady. Jonathan chuckled darkly. "That's your solution to everything, isn't it? Just keep moving forward." Vera tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. "What else is there? You've already made your choice, there's no going back now." He ran a hand through his dark hair, frustration mount. "What's your plan, Vera?" Jonathan asked, his tone softening just a bit. "What are you really trying to accomplish here? What's your role in all this?" She looked at him for a moment before responding, her voice almost a whisper. "I'm here to find alliances, Jonathan. To help my people navigate a galaxy that's becoming more dangerous by the day. And, yes, that means I have to work with humans whether we like it or not. But I also have my own people to answer to, and right now, they are watching me closely." Jonathan absorbed her words. He knew that the consequences of their actions would have repercussions far beyond the immediate future. He could only imagine what the political fallout would be once they returned to the Astralis system and Earth. If they even made it that far. "What about you?" Vera continued, her voice almost a challenge. "What do you want from all of this?" Jonathan hesitated, then leaned back in his chair, letting out a long sigh. "I don't know anymore," he admitted. "I came here for a paycheck. I wanted to escape the monotony of my life. But now it's about more than that. I don't even know what I'm doing half the time. I just know I can't turn my back on this." Vera nodded, as if understanding more than he had expected. "You're not the only one caught between worlds, Jonathan. You're not the only one who has to make impossible choices." For a brief moment, their eyes locked, an unspoken understanding passing between them. In that moment, Jonathan realized that, despite their differences, they were in this together. Neither of them had chosen this path, but they were both bound by it now. The communication system suddenly beeped, pulling them both back to the present. Jonathan quickly glanced at the display, noting the incoming signal. It was an encrypted transmission, one that only he and a few trusted contacts on Earth could access. He punched in the code to decrypt the message. The screen flickered, and the face of a man appeared. Captain Mason, his superior on Earth. "Jonathan, this is Captain Mason," the man's voice crackled through the speakers. "We've received reports of the attack on the Celestial Envoy. The situation is more complicated than we thought. The ship was carrying a high-ranking diplomat from the Astralis system, and we've intercepted messages suggesting that the Krell may be working with a faction of the Astralis government. We need you to return to Earth as soon as possible. The higher UPS want to know what happened out there, and they need answers." Jonathan's heart sank. The political web was getting more tangled by the minute. The Krell weren't just a random threat, they were tied to something much larger, something that could threaten the fragile peace between Earth and the Astralis system. "We'll head back right away," Jonathan said, his voice firm despite the unease bubbling in his chest. The transmission ended abruptly, leaving an unsettling silence in its wake. Jonathan looked at Vera, who had been listening intently. "They want answers," Jonathan muttered, more to himself than to her. Vera's expression was unreadable, but there was something in her eyes, a flicker of uncertainty, perhaps, or resignation. "They'll get them," she said quietly. "But at what cost?" Jonathan couldn't answer. He didn't have an answer. All he knew was that he was caught in a web of politics, danger, and decisions that were far beyond his understanding. And as much as he wanted to get back to Earth, part of him knew that the journey ahead would only get darker, more complex. They set a course for Earth, the Nomad's engines humming as they cut through the black void of space. Jonathan stared out at the stars, wondering what kind of world awaited him back home and what kind of world he would return to once all of this was over. As the Nomad made its way through the depths of space, Jonathan's thoughts were a turbulent mix of doubts and questions. The stars outside the viewport stretched into infinity, but his mind kept returning to the message he had just received from Captain Mason. Earth wanted answers, and those answers might not be as simple as he'd hoped. What had started as a routine mission had now escalated into a political minefield, and Jonathan knew that there was no easy way out. Vera sat in silence beside him, her gaze fixed on the stars as well. She had been unusually quiet ever since the transmission. Jonathan had expected her to say something, to offer her insights into the situation, but for now, she seemed lost in her own thoughts. He leaned back in his seat, crossing his arms over his chest, staring out into the endless void. "I never expected things to go this far," he muttered, half to himself. Vera's voice broke the silence, soft and steady. "No one ever does. We just adapt. It's what we have to do to survive." Jonathan glanced at her, noticing the way her lavender eyes reflected the starlight. There was something distant in her expression, like she was seeing beyond the stars, beyond the ship, into something much larger. Maybe it was the way she had grown accustomed to navigating the dangerous political waters of her own people, but she seemed unshaken by the complexity of the situation. For a moment, Jonathan envied her calmness. He wasn't sure how to handle all of this. The Krell, the Astralis system, Earth's involvement, it was all too much. Too many forces were at play, and he was caught right in the middle of them, with no clear way to resolve the chaos. "You said you were looking for alliances," Jonathan said, turning his head to face her. "But it feels like everything's falling apart. What does that even mean, to find an alliance, in all this?" Vera met his gaze, her expression softening just slightly. "It means survival, Jonathan. For us. For everyone. Our galaxy is on the brink of war. The Krell are only one piece of a much larger puzzle. If we can't secure alliances, we risk losing everything." Jonathan nodded, though the weight of her words was heavy. He had known that this mission was about more than just resources or money, but hearing it put into such stark terms made the reality feel much closer, much more immediate. The consequences of their actions, the choices they made, could have a ripple effect across the galaxy. A sudden jolt from the ship's control systems interrupted his thoughts. The Nomad had exited the jump gate, and Earth's moon loomed large in the viewport, a stark reminder that they were nearing their destination. Jonathan straightened in his seat, suddenly feeling the pressure of what was to come. The familiar sight of Earth's moon felt both comforting and ominous at the same time. He had been away for months, and now he was returning with far more baggage than he had left with. "Earth's not the same as it used to be," Jonathan said, half to himself. "Things have changed since I left." Vera didn't respond right away. Instead, she looked at the planet, her gaze distant. "Change is inevitable. You'll see that when you get there. But you have to remember that Earth is only one part of this larger conflict. What happens here will affect everyone." Jonathan's hand instinctively reached for the controls as he began to align the ship's descent. The weight of her words hung in the air like an unspoken warning. He knew that whatever awaited him on Earth would be more than just a debriefing. The political stakes had grown too high, and he had already made too many decisions that couldn't be undone. He could feel the tension in the air as the Nomad descended through Earth's atmosphere. He wasn't sure what awaited him down there, but he had a nagging sense that things were about to get even more complicated. As the ship touched down on the tarmac of a military base on Earth's western coast, Jonathan's pulse quickened. A small ground crew approached the ship, their movements precise and coordinated, as if they had been waiting for this moment. But as soon as the hatch opened and he stepped out onto the tarmac, Jonathan saw the faces of people he didn't recognize, their eyes hard and unreadable. He didn't have time to adjust before a man in a military uniform approached him. His face was stern, and there was an air of authority about him that made Jonathan stand a little straighter. "Jonathan Vega," the man said, his voice clipped and formal. "We've been briefed on your situation. You'll need to come with us." Jonathan exchanged a brief glance with Vera before nodding. This wasn't a simple return to Earth. This was the beginning of something far more dangerous. As they were escorted to a secure transport, Jonathan couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the start. The questions, the politics, the complications, they were only beginning. The doors of the transport closed behind them, sealing them inside. Jonathan's mind raced, but Vera sat beside him in silence, her hands folded in her lap. He could sense the weight of everything they had just gone through hanging in the air between them. There was no turning back now. The transport moved through the bustling streets of Earth's capital, the sprawling cityscape outside the window a stark contrast to the quiet of space. Jonathan sat in the back, his arms crossed, trying to steady his thoughts. The tension in the air was palpable, and he could feel Vera's presence beside him like a constant reminder that things were only going to get more complicated. The military base they arrived at was heavily guarded, an imposing structure on the outskirts of the city. It was clear that this wasn't just any regular base. Jonathan knew that whoever controlled this place had significant power, and he was walking into the heart of that power without any idea of what was waiting for him. Vera remained silent as they were escorted into the building, her eyes scanning the surroundings with a sense of familiarity that Jonathan couldn't help but notice. It was as though she was prepared for something he wasn't, something far more dangerous than just a simple debriefing. They were led down a sterile corridor, the walls made of cold metal and the overhead lights buzzing with a soft hum. Finally, they reached a large, reinforced door. The officer who had been accompanying them gave a sharp salute to the guards posted outside and signaled for the door to be opened. Jonathan stepped inside first, followed by Vera, and they were immediately met by a group of high-ranking officials sitting around a large circular table. The atmosphere in the room was one of controlled tension. At the head of the table sat a woman in a crisp military uniform, her hair pulled back into a tight bun, and her eyes sharp with an intensity that made Jonathan feel uneasy. "Jonathan Vega," the woman said, her voice cold and measured. "We've been following your mission, and we have much to discuss." Jonathan didn't speak right away. Instead, he glanced at Vera, who stood by his side, her expression unreadable. The woman at the head of the table nodded at Vera before turning back to Jonathan. "I understand you've had a rather eventful journey. But you're not here to talk about your personal experiences. What you've uncovered during your time on Naram is of critical importance to the future of Earth and the wider galaxy. I assume you're aware of the stakes." Jonathan stood straighter, his military training kicking in. "I'm aware. But I'm not sure exactly what you're asking me to do. My mission was to gather data, not to get entangled in political maneuvering." The woman leaned forward slightly, her eyes narrowing. "We don't have the luxury of keeping things simple, Mr. Vega. The Krell are just one part of a much larger picture. You've uncovered something far more dangerous than anyone anticipated." Jonathan felt a flicker of unease at her words. He had known that there was more at stake, but hearing her speak with such certainty made everything feel more urgent, more immediate. "You're talking about the conflict with the Krell?" Jonathan asked, trying to keep his voice steady. The woman shook her head. "No. That's just the surface. The true threat lies with the Astralis system." Jonathan blinked, caught off guard. "Astralis? But I thought... You thought it was just another peaceful system trying to make alliances, didn't you?" The woman's voice was laced with bitterness. "The truth is, Astralis has been playing a very dangerous game for years, and now their actions have drawn the attention of factions far more powerful than they can handle. Your encounter with the Krell was no accident, Mr. Vega. It's all connected." Jonathan absorbed her words, the implications settling over him like a heavy weight. He had come to Naram for resources, for answers about the Krell, but this was something else entirely. Something that threatened not only Earth but every system in the galaxy. Vera finally spoke, her voice calm but firm. "What exactly do you want us to do?" The woman looked at Vera for a long moment, then nodded. "We need you to help us understand what Astralis is really up to. We've been monitoring their activities, but their movements are becoming more unpredictable. If we don't act quickly, we risk being drawn into a conflict we're not prepared for." Jonathan exchanged a glance with Vera. She seemed unfazed by the woman's demands, but Jonathan could see the subtle tension in her posture. He wasn't sure if it was the pressure of the situation or something deeper, but Vera was clearly aware of the stakes in a way that he wasn't. The woman continued. "We need a liaison. Someone who can bridge the gap between Earth and Astralis, someone with first-hand experience. That's where you come in, Mr. Vega. You have the connections, the knowledge. You've seen things no one else has. We need you to act as our intermediary." Jonathan shook his head slightly. "You're asking me to be a diplomat?" The woman's lips curled into a thin smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Something like that. But more importantly, we need you to keep this situation from escalating further. If Astralis sees us as a threat, it could spark a war. And we're not ready for that." There was a long pause as Jonathan processed her words. The weight of the responsibility was beginning to sink in. He hadn't signed up for any of this. All he wanted was to complete his mission, collect his data, and return to Earth. But now, He was being thrust into a game of galactic politics with far more at stake than his own survival. "What do you need me to do first?" Jonathan asked, his voice steady despite the turmoil in his mind. The woman's gaze softened, just a little. "We need you to gather intelligence from Astralis. They are hiding something, and we need to know what it is before they make their next move." Vera spoke up again, her voice calm but sharp. "And what happens if they don't cooperate?" "Then we'll make them cooperate," the woman said coldly. "At any cost." Jonathan felt a shiver run down his spine. This was no longer just about completing a mission. It was about survival, and the survival of far more than just him. The stakes had just been raised to a level he hadn't anticipated. As the meeting came to an end, Jonathan and Vera were escorted to a waiting room, the heavy door closing behind them with a dull thud. Jonathan leaned against the wall, his mind racing with the information he had just been given. "This just got a lot more complicated," he muttered. Vera didn't answer right away. She was looking out the window, her expression unreadable. "I didn't expect it to be easy," she said finally, her voice almost a whisper. "But we'll make it work." Jonathan wasn't so sure. But he had no choice now. The wheels were already in motion, and he was stuck in the middle of it all. All he could do was follow the path, wherever it led. Jonathan's mind was spinning as he and Vera were escorted out of the meeting room, the heavy door closing behind them with a resounding thud. The weight of the mission he had just been thrust into was starting to settle in, but he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the situation than he was being told. His thoughts raced as they moved down the sterile, white corridor, their footsteps echoing off the metal floors. Vera walked beside him in silence, her expression unreadable. She had always been good at keeping her emotions in check, something Jonathan admired but also found unsettling at times. She was a professional, capable of staying calm in situations where most people would crumble. But right now, even her usual calmness couldn't mask the tension that lingered between them. Jonathan's mind kept returning to the woman at the head of the table, the officer who had outlined the mission so coldly. There had been something about her, something calculating in the way she spoke. She hadn't been just a military official, she was a player in a much larger game, and he was now a pawn in it. "Vera," Jonathan said, breaking the silence, "what do you think they are not telling us?" Vera glanced over at him, her gaze hard. "They are hiding a lot. But you're not the only one with questions. Astralis, the whole situation smells like trouble." Jonathan nodded. The more he thought about it, the more it felt like he had been pulled into something far bigger than he could comprehend. What was so important about Astralis? Why had their actions drawn the attention of so many powerful factions? And why was he, of all people, being asked? They reached the end of the corridor, where they were led to a small, nondescript room. It was sparse, with only a few chairs and a table in the center. There was no window, no indication of where they were in the complex, and Jonathan took a seat at the table, his thoughts still clouded. The situation with Astralis was far from simple, but it was clear that if they didn't act quickly, things could spiral out of control. The woman had made that much clear. But how? Vera leaned against the wall, arms crossed, her gaze distant. "We need to figure out what's really going on with Astralis. Something doesn't eh?" The command center buzzed with activity as Jonathan and Vera stood in the center of it all, the weight of their new mission sinking in. The tablet still sat in Jonathan's hand, the words Project X searing in his mind. It was a name, a label, but it held so much more. It was a warning, one that they couldn't afford to ignore. The officer who had briefed them on the intel, a man named Captain Rook, stood with his arms crossed, watching them. His expression was grave, but there was a flicker of something else in his eyes, uncertainty, perhaps, or worry. He'd been in the military long enough to know that things were rarely as simple as they seemed. Project X, Jonathan repeated, turning the tablet over in his hands, as if the screen would reveal more to him if he looked at it from a different angle. What kind of technology are we talking about? Rook's gaze hardened. We don't know the specifics, but we believe it involves quantum manipulation. Time, space, maybe even the very fabric of reality itself. The kind of technology that could destabilize entire sectors if it falls into the wrong hands. Jonathan felt his stomach twist. And you think Astralis has this kind of power? We have reason to believe they've been developing it for years, Rook replied. But the Krell aren't the only ones who have taken an interest in Astralis. There are other factions that have already started to move. And that's why we need you and Vera to infiltrate Astralis, to gather intel, to figure out exactly what Project X is and what they plan to do with it. Vera stepped forward, her eyes narrow with suspicion. What other factions? And why us? Why not send a full-scale team? Rook hesitated, as though weighing the consequences of revealing too much. The other factions are complicated. Some are friendly, some are not. And as for sending a larger team, this mission requires discretion. Subtlety. We can't afford to make waves before we know exactly what we're dealing with. You two are the best we have for this kind of operation. Jonathan glanced at Vera, who met his gaze with a look that said everything without needing words. They both knew this wasn't just a diplomatic mission anymore, it was espionage, and it would take everything they had to pull it off. The stakes were higher than ever. Do we have any leads on where to start? Jonathan asked, trying to push the unease that was building in his chest to the back of his mind. Several, Rook replied. But the first step is to get to the heart of Astralis. We need to find the core of Project X. There's a facility, hidden deep within their territory, where we believe the research is being conducted. It's heavily guarded, but we have intel suggesting it's your best bet to uncover what they are really up to. Vera nodded, her expression unreadable. And once we get in, what then? Rook's lips pressed into a thin line. Once you're inside, you'll need to gather everything. The data, the research, any personnel you can question. We don't know how deep this goes, so be prepared for anything. Jonathan exhaled slowly, processing the gravity of the situation. There were too many unknowns. Too many risks. But he knew he had no choice but to follow through. Understood, Vera said, her voice steady, her resolve already solidifying. We'll get it done. Rook gave them a sharp nod. I'll brief you further once you're en route. But for now, get some rest. You'll need it. The command center fell into a quiet lull as the officers returned to their stations, their eyes flicking back and forth between screens, their fingers dancing across keyboards. Jonathan and Vera exchanged one last glance before following Rook out of the room. As they walked down the hallway, Jonathan couldn't shake the feeling that they were standing on the edge of something far darker than they'd ever imagined. The galaxy had always been a dangerous place, but now it felt like they were about to face a threat that could change everything. Once they were back in their temporary quarters, Vera immediately began to prepare. She didn't speak much, but Jonathan could see the way she moved, the efficiency with which she gathered gear, sorted through intel, and ensured their communications were secure. She was focused, laser-focused, and it was clear that she wasn't just preparing for a mission, she was preparing for a war. Jonathan, on the other hand, felt the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He had always been good under pressure, but this was different. This was more than just a mission. This was a gamble with the future of the galaxy. He sat down at the small desk in the room, pulling up a screen with the data they'd received. The information on Project X was sparse, but every scrap they had suggested that whatever Astralis was working on, it was going to be catastrophic if it fell into the wrong hands. The fact that multiple factions were already moving to contain the situation meant that things were already starting to unravel. It wasn't just about stopping Astralis anymore. It was about preventing a galactic war, one that could consume everything in its path. Vera, Jonathan called, his voice low. You ever wonder what we're really up against? Vera didn't look up from her work, but she paused for a moment, as though considering his question. I don't have time to wonder, she said quietly, her voice tinged with a hint of bitterness. I just have time to survive. Jonathan couldn't argue with that. There were too many unknowns in play, and the risks were mounting. They had no idea what Astralis was hiding, but whatever it was more dangerous than anything they had encountered before. And if they didn't act fast, the galaxy might not survive long enough for anyone to even care. I'll be ready, Jonathan said, more to himself than to Vera. Good, she replied. We'll leave in 2 hours. Get some rest while you can. Jonathan leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. As much as he wanted to push the thoughts away, he couldn't. The mystery of Project X, the uncertainty of Astralis' plans, and the sheer scale of what they were about to walk into weighed heavily on him. This wasn't just a mission. This was a turning point. A chance to either prevent the collapse of everything they knew, or to usher in the beginning of the end. He had no choice but to keep moving forward. The stakes were too high for hesitation. And as the minutes ticked by, Jonathan couldn't shake the feeling that the storm was coming, and when it hit, nothing would ever be the same again. Jonathan and Vera stood in front of the reinforced door, the weight of their mission pressing heavily on their shoulders. Vera input a series of codes, and with a soft hiss, the door slid open, revealing a dimly lit corridor beyond. The air inside the facility was thick with tension, as if the very walls were holding their breath. They moved silently, each step measured and deliberate. Jonathan could feel the electric hum of the facility's power running through the floors, the sharp contrast to the frozen wasteland they had just come from. Their goal was clear: find the heart of Project X and stop it whatever the cost. As they moved deeper into the complex, the walls seemed to close in around them. The quiet was unnerving, a stark contrast to the chaos that had led them here. They reached a large door, its surface covered in strange symbols and markings that Jonathan didn't recognize. Vera stepped forward, her fingers moving quickly over the control panel. Here we go, she said quietly, her voice steady but betraying a hint of anxiety. The door slid open with a hiss, revealing a massive chamber inside. At the center stood a large, metallic structure, something that resembled a quantum engine, its design alien and incomprehensible. It pulsed with an eerie light, its core throbbing like a beating heart. This is it, Jonathan whispered, stepping forward cautiously. Vera's eyes were fixed on the structure, her expression unreadable. This is the source of their power. The key to Project X. If they've harnessed this, if they've learned to manipulate the fabric of reality itself, then nothing will stop them. Jonathan approached the machine slowly, feeling an overwhelming sense of dread as the room seemed to hum with energy. He didn't know what this thing was, but he could sense the danger. Every instinct told him to destroy it, to bring an end to the nightmare before it could spread. But before he could act, a voice echoed through the chamber. Jonathan Vega. Vera. They spun around, weapons drawn, but there was no immediate threat. The voice came from a figure standing in the shadows at the far side of the room. It was a man, dressed in a dark, military uniform. His face was partially obscured by a mask, but his eyes burned with an unmistakable intensity. "You've come far," the man said, his voice smooth, almost mocking. "But this is where your journey ends." Jonathan's mind raced. "Who are you?" The man stepped forward, revealing his full figure. He was tall, imposing, and there was something about his presence that made the air grow colder. "I am the one who brought Project X to life. And now, I am the one who will ensure its success." Vera's eyes narrowed. "You're the one behind this madness?" The man nodded. "I've been preparing for this moment for years. The Krell, the Astralis system, they were just pieces of a much larger puzzle. A puzzle that now, you've become a part of." Jonathan felt the weight of the words sink in. This wasn't just a mission to stop a dangerous weapon, this was a game of galactic proportions, one that had been unfolding in the shadows for far longer than he had realized. "What do you want?" Jonathan demanded. The man's smile was chilling. "To reshape the universe. To take control of time, space, and reality itself. To break the chains that bind us and become the true rulers of this galaxy." Jonathan's heart pounded in his chest. The stakes were higher than he could have imagined. He had come here to stop a conflict, to prevent a war. But now he was faced with a far greater threat, a being who sought to bend the very fabric of existence to his will. Vera stepped forward, her hand on her weapon. "We won't let you do this." The man's smile faded, replaced by a cold, calculating expression. "You have no idea what you're up against. You cannot stop what's already in motion." Before Jonathan could react, the man pressed a button on his wrist, and the room began to tremble. The quantum engine hummed louder, its core beginning to glow brighter, sending waves of energy pulsing through the facility. "Run!" Vera shouted, pulling Jonathan away from the machine. They sprinted toward the exit as the room around them shook, the walls cracking and the floor splitting. The man's laughter echoed in the chaos, a sound that sent chills down Jonathan's spine. As they made it out of the chamber, the entire facility seemed to be coming apart. The ground cracked beneath their feet, and the walls buckled inward. Jonathan could hear the hum of the quantum engine growing louder, its power threatening to consume everything. "Vera!" Jonathan shouted, grabbing her arm. "We have to destroy it." Vera's eyes were wide with determination. "There's no time. We have to escape, now." The facility began to collapse around them as they raced toward the transport bay. The door was already closing, but Jonathan and Vera managed to slip through just as it sealed shut. They were thrust into the cold of space, the facility crumbling behind them. As the transport sped away, Jonathan could see the light from the quantum engine fading into the distance. The facility, and everything within it, was gone, destroyed in the wake of the power they had unleashed. They were safe for now. But Jonathan knew that the war was far from over. The man they had encountered, the mastermind behind Project X, was still out there, and the threat of reality itself being torn apart was still very real. As the transport headed back toward Earth, Jonathan glanced at Vera. "What now?" Vera's expression was grim, her eyes focused on the stars ahead. "Now, we prepare for what's coming. Because this is just the beginning. The end of one chapter, the start of another." And Jonathan had no doubt that whatever lay ahead, it would be even more dangerous than what they had already faced. The galaxy was on the brink of a new age, one that would test the very limits of time, space, and existence itself. And Jonathan and Vera were at the center of it all, standing at the precipice of a war that could change everything.